need to put that down. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. Oh, it always helps to turn it on. Is that on? Now you can hear me. Okay, thank you. Well, thank Marilyn. I really appreciate that. And I want to thank Jack Padalino and also Keith Wheeler for their great leadership with the Brandwein Foundation. And also congratulations to David Brown. The folks that do the work that you do and that all of you do are really, in a way, my heroes. The journalists, you know, there are some people who do, and then there are some people who write about people who do. And I'm one of the people that writes about people that do. And I like to think that I'm the cheerleader for the people that I admire. And there are many of them in the book, and there are many of them here today. The work that you do, I think, is sacred work. And I mean that in the broadest, non-denominational way. And something tells me, speaking of religion, that I'm probably preaching to the choir today, which is, I think there's a lot to be said for preaching to the choir, because we don't get to sing together very much these days. I would guess that many of you may be one of, if not the only teacher in your school that actually takes kids outdoors. I would suspect that some other teachers, some of your fellow teachers come to you puzzled by what you do. And some of them come to you hungry to go outside themselves as teachers. And they often don't know where to start. Increasingly, we have young teachers coming up, just as we have young parents, a generation that may not have had much experience in nature themselves because of the widening gap between the young and the natural world. And so increasingly, this is quite a challenge for education. It's also a challenge for the great work that you do when you care about the outdoors and take kids outdoors, because you're likely swimming upstream, sailing against the wind in terms of standards-based, test-centric education, so-called reform. I always think it's interesting when people talk about standards-based education as being something new, as if everybody who taught before that had no standards. And increasingly, I find great resonance out there whenever I started using the phrase "leave no child inside" as a needed educational campaign. I started using that for about a year ago, and I found that that was my one guaranteed applause line. It didn't happen today. What's wrong? But there's great frustration with the direction of education now, as it takes people out of experience. So much of what we do in daily life now, in school or out, has nothing to do with real experience. It's all once, second, third removed, so much of it, increasingly. Now, that's not to say that electronics are bad. I have a Trio right here that I'm addicted to. And I read email at night in bed, which really ticks my wife off. So, and my kids had video games. I don't think that video games are the spawn of the devil. Maybe the stepchildren, but not the spawn. And my sons, who are now 19 and 25, take great delight in reminding me at every occasion that they can, that they once got me, not once, but several times, got me to play Grand Theft Auto, and that I got out of control and ran over everything in sight, including the good people, you know, on the screen. So they remind me of that from time to time. So I think it's too easy to blame so much in society on electronics. It's too easy to blame it on electronic games, et cetera. That's not to say they're not very seductive. They are. And television certainly steals time. I don't necessarily agree that the great threat of television is because it somehow stimulates violence in children. I think a more important issue is that it steals time. And also an important issue is that it creates depression. You know, all you have to do is sit there and watch the TV late at night and flip for a while and then monitor how you feel. And it's not going to be great. You're not going to feel uplifted. Increasingly, we have this onslaught of images and sounds and messages that are fear-based. I was in Denver yesterday. I was there to speak to a National Association of Zoos and Aquariums. In a discussion group afterwards, someone said, they stood up and they said, you know, it almost seems as if the society is moving towards some central organizing principle with which we are not familiar. And he wondered what that was. And I suggested the possibility, and I hope I'm wrong about this, that the central organizing principle of our culture is no longer democratic values, is no longer even capitalism. The central organizing principle of our society today is fear. I hope I'm wrong about that. I wrote a column a couple years ago about what I considered the cultural depression. And I compared that to what I considered to be a good parallel, which is the Great Economic Depression in the 1930s. And I think that we have been in a cultural depression, which is every bit as destructive, and it's based on fear. And it's interesting that the line that is often quoted about the Great Depression was FDR's, which is, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Last week, it may be in this week's issue, in Newsweek, there's a Great My Turn column. The title of it is, "We have protected our children from everything except fear." When I talk to parents, when I talked to them when I was researching the book, I expected several things to be the reason that kids weren't going outside very much anymore. One of them I thought would be access to nature. You know, the woods that I grew up in are no longer there. So it's tough for the kids in that house growing up today to go outside and play in nature. It just, access counts, it's important. But if you go to the new edge of Kansas City, where I grew up at, that looks just like the edge of Kansas City that I grew up in, the suburban edge, woods right behind my house. And you go to that same setting at the farther edge now of Kansas City, and you'll find that kids aren't going outside there either, even though the woods are right there. So access counts, but it doesn't count as much as I thought it did in terms of why kids aren't going outside very much. Yes, I heard a lot about electronics, and as I say, it's seductive. And I heard a lot of parents saying they had no time. And with 2 career households and more economic pressure, which, by the way, a lot of that is fear-based. We're just terrified that somebody's going to catch up with us. We're going to fall behind. We're going to lose our health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. Much of that economic running is fear-based. That's true. But, you know, we make a lot of time for things we don't think we have time for. So I don't think it's necessarily time. I do think that the fear issue is the paramount issue. Some of the pressure you see on your students is from parents who fear that they will fall. They fear that their children will fall behind, that they won't get into Harvard, they won't get into the Ivy League, you know, and that something terrible will happen to their lives if they don't. And the pressure that is always on these kids is enormous from the society and sometimes from the schools. The major fear that parents feel is fear of strangers. They're scared to death that something is going to happen to their child when their child steps out the front door. I have to tell you that as a parent, I felt that fear too, even though I knew better. As a journalist, I'd written about it. I'd seen the statistics. I'd seen how the numbers don't add up. And yet I felt that fear too. And my sons did not have the kind of free-range childhood that I did. The fear is irrational. When you look at the numbers, the number of abductions, et cetera, of any kind, have actually been either stable or going down for the last 20 years, depending on which study you look at. The number, almost all child abductions are by a relative or someone the family knows. The vast majority, over 90%. There are about 100 of the classic stranger abductions in America every year, and that number stays fairly stable. Sometimes it goes down. Now, one of those is too many, clearly. But should 100 crimes change our whole culture? It seems that that is happening. I hold my own profession responsible for that. As it was said, I was a columnist for 24 years. I've written for newspapers for most of my adult life. I like to think it's not us print guys, it's the electronic guys. But indeed, it's us too. But all you have to do is watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox, and you will see how they take a handful of terrible crimes against children, and they repeat that handful every year over and over and over again. When they get done telling us about the crime, then they tell us about the trial over and over and over again. And every kidnapping, every terrible thing that happens to a child becomes a national story. These are not national stories. These are local stories, except in certain cases that are extreme, even more extreme than the norm, whatever that, if you can use that word norm. And yet they're treated on par with the Iraq War. That is the very definition of conditioning, when those stories are repeated over and over and over again. There's no accident that we feel this fear. My profession, I am, you are, we are being conditioned by my profession to live in a state of fear. I'm not sure what to do about that. I try to turn the TV off a lot more than I did in the past because of the way it makes me feel. The evidence for this break from nature, generational break, is not based on major longitudinal studies comparing how many hours kids spent in nature in 1950 compared to 1960 or 1980 and so on. The reason is those longitudinal studies for the most part don't exist because nobody thought to ask the question, because we always assumed that this relationship between children and nature would be ongoing forever. What we do know is a lot of circumstantial evidence and, of course, a lot of anecdotal evidence. The circumstantial evidence is more important. We pretty much know what children are doing with their lives. 44 hours a week spent plugged into some kind of electronic medium, more and more hours doing homework, more and more hours in the back seat of the minivan on the way to the play date, watching the flip-down screen of National Geographic specials about nature instead of looking out the window. Kids don't have very much time at all for any kind of free play, let alone going out into the woods or the fields. And I won't go into all the other evidence, but it's having a profound effect. I do want to say that this is not, I don't believe, an exercise in nostalgia. I'm not just comparing my boys' childhood to mine. They did have a lot of nature, by the way, even though I was scared. We did a lot of fishing. I took them into nature. My wife and I did a lot of hiking with them, a lot of camping. It was very intentional, very different from the way that my parents exposed me to nature, which was saying, go outside and don't come back until the streetlights come on. And some days it was, don't come back when the streetlights come on. The issue of nostalgia sometimes comes up, and I will plead guilty to romanticizing certain parts of my childhood. But when you think about it, for all of human history and prehistory, human children went outside and spent much of their life, much of their developing time, either playing or working in nature. For all of human history and prehistory. And in Western society, within the last 30 years, at an accelerating pace, we've been seeing that almost disappear. It is not too late to turn that around. And that has much to do with the important work that you do in your teaching. The effects of this are already being seen. Now, some of these effects are combined with other issues. But the national parks, we're seeing a dramatic drop in the attendance in national parks, particularly of children and families. The rangers in national parks now talk about windshield camping, drive-through hiking. Well over 90% of the people who visit parks never get a quarter mile from their car. They're seeing that drop. That has real political implications for who is going to support national parks in the future if that continues. The studies of conservationists, environmentalists, whatever we want to call them, showed that almost to a person they had some transcendent experience in nature when they were kids. What happens if that ends, or virtually ends, in this generation and in future ones? Who will be the future stewards of the earth? I was in Ukiah, California a few months ago speaking. And Ukiah is Spotted Owl Central, one of those towns with the controversy about the spotted owl. It's a beautiful place with trees, mist in the pines. And the educators there told me that the kids aren't going outside there either. Now that raises an interesting question. If kids are not going outside there, who in the world in 10 or 15 years is going to care about the spotted owl or any other endangered species? The environmental organizations, I'm not easy on them in the book, but in the last year and a half I've seen a real turnaround. I've been asked to speak to the board of the Sierra Club. Sierra Club is investing a lot more now in Children in Nature. Some of it they're investing in this Children in Nature network that was mentioned. National Wildlife Federation, which has always been dedicated to this issue, asked me to come back when they saw the galleys of the book almost 2 years ago. And they said that it was helping them in their soul searching as an institution. They had realized that Ranger Rick is great, but it's still secondary experience. And they had to figure out how to get kids directly engaged with nature. And they've been working on that with the Green Hour program and others. The Trust for Public Land is moving in this direction. Many of the large environmental organizations have realized that they've done a good job of recruiting members. I'm sorry, they've done a good job of raising money, but they've done a lousy job of raising new members. If you look at their membership, they look a lot like me. They're aging. They're kind of like newspaper readers. Again, where are they going to get their members in the future? The Outdoor Industry Association had me give the keynote last year to one of their 2 major meetings that they have every year. They're concerned. They're looking at their numbers. And they're seeing, this is the REIs, et cetera, they're seeing their sales healthy in terms of high-end yuppie and baby boomer gear that tends to stay in the garage. But what they're seeing at the same time, though, is a dramatic fall in the sales of entry-level gear, outdoor equipment, to the extent that some of these companies have stopped making it, which of course is self-fulfilling. They're asking, will there be an outdoor industry as we know it in 10 or 15 years? I was recently in Canada. This movement has now spread to Canada, and I was recently there, and the head of and I can never remember the name of this company. I've got to imprint that. It's the largest seller of outdoor equipment in Canada, and it's like REI. It's equivalent to that. It's a co-op like REI is. In Canada, they have 4 million members. The head of that told me, and he'd been at this event in Salt Lake that I spoke at, he said that they are so concerned that one of the things that they are seriously considering, I think they're going to do it, as a company, as a co-op, is that they're going to start renting for free outdoor equipment to the kids of all their members. That's a major commitment. It's also smart marketing if you want new members. But very concerned about the future of his industry. Let me back up for a little bit and just talk about the experience that many of us share that is at the root of this in our experience. Many of you look about my age. A lot of you look younger. 2 or 3 look older. When I was a boy, I grew up, as I said, on the edge of Kansas City in Raytown, Missouri. It was the ticky-tacky boxes suburb. And I could go out my back door as an 8-year-old, through the yard, through the hedge, into the cornfield where my underground fort was. And then beyond that, into the woods and the farms that seemed to go on forever. I spent most of my childhood in those woods. I owned those woods. They were my woods, and you remember, many of you, what that felt like. I owned them so much that I pulled out, I think, hundreds of survey stakes that I knew had something to do with the bulldozers. So how many here pulled out survey stakes? Look at this. Isn't this great? This is, see, science teachers, you know, we have to, this has to be required, I think. You are hereby inducted into the secret society of stake pullers. In fact, you are stakeholders in that society. I had that great sense of ownership of that land, of those woods. They were in my heart. They are in my heart today. I go to them sometimes for strength today, even though they were bulldozed long ago. Many of you became science teachers, I think, because you had a special place. Maybe a woods, maybe some fields, maybe next to a stream, maybe a beach. And that place is still in you today, and you go to it sometimes for strength. The real question is, will future generations have that place to go to in their heart? I couldn't have told you anything, though, as an 8-year-old about global warming. Of course, we didn't know it then, but I couldn't have told you about the Amazon rainforest. I had no clue that my woods were connected ecologically to other woods. Education today is doing a wonderful job teaching kids about that. My profession of the news media is doing a good job teaching people about the big, a fairly good job, teaching people about the big ecological issues. So kids today can tell you a lot about the Amazon rainforest, but as you know, many times they cannot tell you about the last time they went out and just watched the leaves move. There's an important issue here that goes beyond learning facts about nature, way beyond. I mean, how many of you remember when you were 3 or 4, maybe, crawling out the backyard, maybe into the trees at the edge of your yard, and finding a rock, and turning over that rock, and finding that you were not alone in the universe? And that sense of awe and wonder that you felt listening to wind in the trees. Wonder is the most important word in this book, in this issue. Another important aspect of this is the full use of the senses. Other than maybe a New York subway, how often do we use all of our senses at the same time? At the same time. Important distinction. All of our senses, you don't do that looking at a screen. I look at screens a lot. I love my Macintosh, but I don't use all of my senses when I'm doing that. But I do when I go out and I go fishing. You know, it just happens. The full use of the senses and a sense of wonder are the absolute necessities for learning. And to the extent that we cut off kids from that, we cut them off from learning. One of the things that has impressed me is, and surprised me, is the amount of support for this book that I've received from many figures in religion, of different kinds of religion. I thought that I would have a problem with that with some sectors, because there are folks, and I respect their view, I don't really agree with it, but I respect it, who worry that somebody like me or you is going to come in and say to their kids, you need to worship nature. I've gotten none of that response that I worried about, and I was very careful with the chapter on the spiritual necessity of nature for children. I was very careful. Still, I worried, but I've gotten, in fact, one of the first champions of the book was the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I think I've learned that smart religious people, whatever religion, understand that all spiritual life begins with a sense of wonder. And where is one of the first windows into wonder? How can we shut that window? How can we do that? And that's what we're doing with many kids. We need to begin to think in terms of comparative risk. And this is something perhaps in your science classes that you could do some work with your kids on. Not preaching to them about it, but perhaps studies could be done by them in their own lives in terms of what are the real risks in their lives. Stranger danger is very low on the list of real risks. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm not saying there isn't danger in nature itself. Somewhere in my garage, and it disappears from time to time depending on when I clean the garage last, but there's a jar, a fruit jar, with about that much formaldehyde in it, and this very pale and unhappy looking copperhead in it, a poisonous snake. And I don't know where that came from. I know it's from my childhood, but I don't have a memory of it. My best friend from junior high visited recently. He says, oh yeah, I know where that came from. He says, and he described seeing me at the bottom of a hill, racing up the hill, my knees are bloody, my elbows are bloody, and I'm waving this live copperhead in the air. And he said, you look so happy. So yes, there are risks. But you know, I try to remind parents that the most poisonous spider in North America lives in their closets. And I did some research on the brown recluse. One of the things I learned is one of its favorite places to hide is in the pile of clothes and jeans on the floor. I tried that on my sons. Didn't work. We need to think in terms of comparative risk. Yes, there is risk outdoors, but there is also a great risk in raising a generation under virtual house arrest. Risk psychologically, risk to their sense of efficacy of their obesity. The reason is the coming wave that's already started of diabetes and heart disease because of the real risk of raising a generation of children under virtual house arrest. Is soccer handling that? The greatest increase in child obesity in our history occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest increase in organized sports for children in our history. Now, clearly other things were going on. A lot of hamburgers were eaten during that time. But soccer is not handling it. All of us remember throwing down our books when we got home from school when we were kids and racing outdoors and maybe playing football in the street, or like I did, going into the woods and building that underground fort. That kind of expenditure of energy really does keep kids healthy. That is a real risk. Pediatricians will tell you that they don't see very many broken bones in kids anymore. What they do see are repetitive stress injuries. which tend to last far longer than any broken bone. Can we turn this trend around? I am more hopeful now than when I was writing the book. I was very careful with the book. I organized it and reorganized it many times because I didn't want people slicing their wrist after the third chapter. I really wanted them to keep reading. So there is hope throughout the book. But that was kind of an editorial decision on my part. Since the book came out, I have felt much more hopeful. I started to learn right away that the audiences in the bookstores, et cetera, that I would talk to were not leaving depressed. Now, I'm a journalist. I'm used to depressing people. And I was surprised by that. There is something intrinsically hopeful about this issue. And in the article that they have provided you in Orion magazine that's out in this month's Orion, I explore that special quality of this issue. It is intrinsically hopeful. We can do something about this. We may feel overwhelmed by many other issues, but we can do something about this one. Secondly, it brings people together. I gave congressional testimony about 3 or 4 weeks ago. There were 6 congressmen. This was the House Appropriations Subcommittee for Interior. And I was asked to do that. And Charles went with me. And she, our associate, she sat behind me, on the chairs, when you give the testimony, you've seen this on TV, and there's this row of chairs, right? And sometimes the lawyer leans forward and whispers into the, I told Cheryl I would have felt a lot more important if she'd done that, and said, "You're going to jail," but she didn't do that. It was very interesting watching the response of these congressmen. There were 2 other people giving testimony, mainly about endangered species, et cetera, and disappearing land. The congressman asked a few perfunctory questions about numbers, about species and land. And then all they wanted to talk about was children and nature. And they all started with stories of their own childhoods. And in those moments, there were no Republicans in the room, and there were no Democrats. There were only people telling stories. And with this sense that how could this go away? How could this end? I mentioned earlier the story about the stakes. When I spoke in Albuquerque last year, I spoke to a group called the Quivira Coalition, which is bringing conservationists, environmentalists, and ranchers together, and they're working together for land trusts, et cetera. It's a very interesting organization. There were about 500 people in the room. Half of them were wearing cowboy hats. Afterwards, in the discussion period, a rancher stood up. He was in his 60s, he had a white handlebar mustache. He was the real deal. His jeans were not acid washed. And he was sunburned. And he said, "You know that story you told about pulling out stakes?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "I did that when I was a boy." And then he began to cry in front of 500 people, half of whom were wearing cowboy hats. And he was deeply embarrassed. But he continued to talk about his sense of grief, that his might be one of the last generations to have that kind of ownership of land. We can do something about this. This issue draws people together. It doesn't matter, I've learned, what somebody's politics or religion are. They all want to tell me about the treehouse they had when they were kids, if they're old enough to have had that kind of experience. Let me end by talking about something I've been thinking a lot more about since the book came out, which is how we talk to young people about the future of the environment, and how we talk to ourselves, which gets to this issue of the cultural depression. I was asked many months ago to speak to a local high school, the students at a local high school. I didn't want to do it. I was home from a trip of travel, and I was tired, and et cetera. And then I started thinking I've written this book about kids, and started feeling guilty. So I went, and I expected 20 kids, and there were 200. They were given extra credit. And I spoke for about an hour, and you could have heard a pin drop, to my astonishment. And it's not because I'm a great speaker, I'm not. It was because of something else. I talked about 2 things. I talked about the fact that their health their senses and their health are connected directly to their experience, direct experience of nature, that both can get better if they spend more time in nature. I told them about the emerging research at the University of Illinois that shows that that experience lengthens kids' attention span, and that kids who have the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, those symptoms get much better with some contact with nature. Kids as young as 5 years old. I suggested that perhaps, not all, but some of the huge increase of the kids being prescribed Ritalin, et cetera, might have something to do with the fact that we've taken nature away from them in the first place. I told them about a photograph I'd seen recently in the back of a magazine in a hotel room. One of those magazines you wonder where they come from. And on the back page was this photograph, this wonderful photograph of this kid on a beach. It was a black and white photograph, and the kid's running along the beach facing the camera. Behind the kid, it's about 5 years old, behind the kid is, it's a California beach, and waves are coming in, dark clouds, storm clouds behind, and this kid's like this, just alive. His eyes are wide. And the story next to it told about this kid, how he was wiggly in class. He was disruptive. The school kicked him out. His parents didn't know what to do, but his parents had been observant parents, and they had seen the calming effect, now supported by hundreds of studies, about 100 studies, about the calming effect of nature on adults and children. But they already knew that just from watching their child. And so for the next 10 years, they took their boy to all kinds of wild areas all over the West. And their kid turned out okay. The photograph was taken in 1906. The little boy was Ansel Adams. Now, what if little Ansel had been given Ritalin? You know, I'm not saying that some kids don't need medication. Clearly they do. But could it be that the huge number of kids now on antidepressants, or the increase in teenage suicide, might have something to do with the fact that we've taken the healing qualities, the calming qualities, the wonder qualities of nature away from kids in the first place? Lots of evidence connecting it to health and cognition. The schools with outdoor classrooms, the kids do better on tests across the board. A new study in California, I won't go into the details, but we're now learning a lot more, fortunately, within the last decade, about how great nature is for healthy child development. And I've not spent enough time talking about this here. But I told those kids in that high school about that. The second thing I talked about was, because of global warming, because of the huge environmental issues that we face, everything in the next 40 years must change. We'll need new kinds of agriculture just to stay up. We'll need, and that's already emerging. We'll need new kinds of energy. Of course, that's already emerging. We'll need new kinds of architecture and urban development, and it's already emerging with green urbanism, et cetera, and biophilic design. Whole new careers will emerge that don't even have a name yet, because everything must change. Now, to a kid sitting in high school, that's pretty good news, actually, when you frame it that way. When the kids left, I turned to the biology teacher who had invited me, and I said, what was that all about? Why were they so attentive? I didn't expect that. And he said, simple, Rich. You said something hopeful about the future of the environment. They never hear that. Every generation, including ours, at that age, has always wanted to build a new civilization. This time, we really need it. This time, you can help them. You can help them by framing these issues in that way, not through the culture of depression, but through the culture of hope. In the end, there is no practical alternative to hope. Thank you.
By far, it was really the most poignant and I think really right to the heart of the matter. One of our traditions with the Brandwein Institute and the Brandwein Lecture is to award the presenter with a crystal from Tiffany's that is engraved. And Mary Brandwein was so happy because as we talked about it 2 weeks before her death, she had seen the video of Richard speaking at the Conservation Learning Summit. And she said he deserved this probably as much or more than any of our previous speakers, because his talk at the Conservation Learning Summit touched her heart and what her passion was.
Oh, that's
So, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Richard's talk was videotaped, and Jack had just told me that it's going to be put on the www.brandwein.org, so you can see copies of this talk on www.brandwein.org. And for those, Richard is doing a book signing from 12 to 1 down in the NSTA bookstore, so if you'd like to get an autographed copy of Richard's book, you best make your way down there. And for those Brandwein Fellows who are coming to our annual luncheon, it's in the Renaissance Hotel across the street on the 21st floor. So thank you very much again.